Okay, we're up to about 14. I think we'll start and we'll let the others join as it comes along. So, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the fifth of 14 workshops around developing a native seed strategy for Australia. So we've had 4 thematic workshops over the last 2 days, and today we're doing the last of the thematic ones, which is on demand. Then after that, we go into a jurisdiction by jurisdiction, as well as some national workshops later on. The purpose of today essentially is to ensure that you have your say and we have an input into formulating the strategy around demand. So we're going to look at the purpose, the opportunities and challenges, and the governance. But just as an icebreaker, and also using the, I'd like you to use the chat line for this, is can everybody go in and just type in whether you expect demand to increase, and if so, what do you expect demand to increase for? Is it going to be for rehabilitation of sites? Is it going to be out of the conservation sector? Is it out of native foods? You know, is it about Indigenous lands? So tell me about your thoughts about demand. Do you think it's going to increase, and where do you think it might increase? So it doesn't really matter. It's just an icebreaker. It's a vox pop, but let's have a stab and let's see what people think. So I'll give you a minute to put that in. Where do you expect demand to grow from over the next 10 years? So looking at the chats, a few things are coming through. Martin's positive. Lucy says for biodiversity restoration and carbon credits. Bush food from Rod. Greg's keen. Threatened species. Needs some investigation on which parts. Biodiversity. Jojo says conservation and carbon sequestration. Landscapes, emerging industries. Mining, offsets, some restoration, carbon offsets, re-veg, grasses, says Tanya. Development and abandoned farms and mines, says Lucy. So thank you very much for that. So today's agenda is essentially, we're here to explore demand, and probably the demand has been the most interesting and challenging part of it because of the nature of the sector. So I've got some slides around demand, and then I've got 2 questions around demand. And we'll see how we go in numbers. Welcome, Rowena. Good to see you online there again. So we've only got 19 participants, so I think we will still break into the breakout groups so everybody can have a say. But we'll spend a fair amount of time just going through demand. Then we're going to look at it finally through the lens of quality, like we have with everything, but with a specific focus about what it means in demand. And then the last bit for the last half an hour of the workshop, for those of you who haven't been involved before, we're just going to talk a bit about some top and tail dimensions of the strategy, particularly the objectives and the governance. And those of you who have been involved in the discussions before are welcome to go. And in that final session, we will also talk about your communications preference and where the project's going from here. So, but without any further ado, I'll just go through some slides to contextualise demand before we get into the discussion. Okay, so look, I'm sorry. These are the 5 strategic design pillars that were in the discussion paper. And demand really comes up very strongly in 3 areas in the pillar. So the first one is under information provision is when and where is native seed needed? The other thing that's part of it is around the quality of native seed, and that's coming up again and again in the discussions around as being a critical issue. But also what came through very strongly in the last 4 workshops was discussion about the need for the broader promotion of native seeds across all of the various sectors that are involved. So a way of thinking about the supply, the native seed sector is as a supply chain with a series of sources, stores, suppliers, users and enablers. And so in many cases, it's both the community and the market, but also particularly government that's a key enabler. But what's really probably the key characteristic of the sector is what's up on the screen now, which is really, we talk about a sector, some people even talk about it as an industry. The way I've presented it here is actually a whole series of different markets. So what we have in this diagram here is saying that, just as a rough summary, there are half a dozen different markets that use native seed. So we have the rehabilitation market that's focused on site remediation and is driven a lot out of the resources and infrastructure industries. That's quite well developed. People believe that accounts for most of the native, a lot of, if not most of the native seed that's actually used. We have the conservation sector, which is really about focused on locations and threatened species. And that's undertaken by a range of public and private organisations as well as individual industries. There's horticulture, where it's used for food, ornamental, and there are always novel and new purposes, which is also drawing out really new and unique properties out of native seeds and plants. And that's used by and large by the food and green life industries. Green life is the new word for the, I suppose, nursery and gardens. Then we have the Indigenous one, where the use is related to conservation, but also culture and the development of commercial and economies for Indigenous communities. And that's undertaken by Indigenous organisations, quite often in partnership with others. We have an offsetting market that's related to biodiversity and carbon sequestration, are the most common. And the users of native seed then are the land managers who do the offsetting, as well as there's a range of brokerage functions that are out there. And there's also the forestry sector who develop wood, who use wood products. And there's a whole series of plantation managers, both in the public and private sector, and they tend to use a limited or lesser number of species. So one of the really important things about is understanding demand is what do users want and what do suppliers want? And so basically what everybody really wants is seed, but practically users want the amount of different species that they require, and the suppliers are obviously very keen to provide the species that they can supply. And we had a session yesterday on supply constraints. What users also want is a delivery to their time frame. And but native seed, there's many different species. There's some complexities around collecting and holding individual species. So a realistic time frame is what's important to the supplier. Obviously, price is important when you buy, and price is important when you sell. And basically, all parties need to have enough to get by. Viability is critical because basically if the seed isn't germinable or it's not adjusted to the climate, then it won't really work as well. So everybody's highly incentivized to make sure that's right. Otherwise you go to other people to get it because seed isn't cheap and you want to get the best out of it that you can. Certainly, location, provenance and increasingly genetic diversity is becoming a feature that people are looking for, and the suppliers can certainly offer that, although it's reported that capability is a bit variable in that space. And lastly, as an underpinning pillar, is people have preferences about who they'd like to source for, but more than anything else, they're looking for doing business with somebody who's reputable. So when we come to matching demand and supply, everybody's pretty positive and demand is expected to increase for some of those reasons you put up on the chat line. But its potential is not really known. And one of the reasons the potential is not known is while things like the horticulture, Indigenous, offsetting sectors, those three in particular, they have what we call emergent properties. So we don't really know the full potential of that. The rehabilitation sector is quite well formed because it's driven by infrastructure and resource projects, so it can be defined. And conservation is the agenda is enormous, so theoretically it's very large, but practically it's smaller. Forestry, on the other hand, is reasonably well declined and is not expected to increase or to increase terribly much. So the other thing is that while the potential varies, demand also varies according to where the markets are at, the environment, and also the policy settings that exist in any day. Targets can help for some markets, but not always. A good example is setting targets around having threatened species and seed banks has increased the number of threatened species and seed banks. There are regional targets for the extent and quality of vegetation, but they're not uniform across, and it works through. So targets have a role, but they're not universal. The other thing is that users' knowledge varies. So for some people, native seed is part of what they do rather than everything they do. And so the role of promotion and education and getting those people involved is very important. And most critically, each market seems to send its own signal in its own way. But if we're going to develop the sector and secure supply, sharing the signals is really, really important. In the paper, we highlighted at the top line 2 ways that you can share information. So a community of practice is really about sharing information, expertise, and finding ways of working together. It's really around a common goal. It's quite often related to a particular species or location or aspect of how you work with native seeds. An exchange, on the other hand, is something where buyers and sellers, and this could be for money or not, it's in that more sort of less literal sense, share information on the seed that is available and needed. And so both can be present at the same time, but ultimately information around meeting the buyers and sellers' needs and availability is critical to growing a sector. So what I'd like to do now is pause and just say, well, what information do you need regularly, and what information are you willing or able to share? What we have here on the left is a series of types of information that people have raised that they would see value in acquiring and sharing. The top of the list is just the names of who the suppliers and users are. There's an appetite for acquiring and sharing knowledge and expertise available. The third one is really about describing the policies, targets, and demand by market, so people generally understand where each of these segments is going. The other one is getting more specific, so the users saying, I need seed X and Y. And similarly with the seed suppliers saying they have seeds Y and Z. And finally, which you see emerge over time, is a record of transactions. So what seed's going where, and ultimately even what price might have been paid for it. And a lot of industries do have records of transactions, but you know, the data, there are no compulsory systems to do that. So the sharing that information and setting up a system for a record of transactions is probably something that will take a lot of work and may take some time to evolve. So this is the first question we're going to have a discussion as a group about, which is what information do you need regularly and what information are you willing to share? I'll go back to the main screen now and just say we've up to about 20 people online, so welcome everybody who's joined since then. Before we go on, do people have any questions or points they'd like to raise, particularly about the question we're going to discuss? All right, welcome back everybody. I think it's quite a challenging set of questions we put up there, and we heard this. You see some of the different perspectives emerging according to the types of organisations that are involved. What I'd like you to do now is what we've done in the previous workshops, is just share your key reflections in the chat box with us. So can you please spend a minute or two just typing in You know, what information do you need and what are you willing to share? Or any other reflection that you've got from the discussion you've just had with your peers. So Lucy says, you know, plenty of notice and preferably broken down at a regional level. What do other people think? So Martin says collated seed requirements are long-term projections, licensing requirements and regional planning. And Lucy talks about realistic species lists. Tanya talks about the frustration of variable income or variable funding. And Paul talks about information to anticipate demand and also about educating purchasers. Cameron talks about long mid-term supply agreements in the industrial markets. Bryony, need enough lead time for collection, education of end users, but isn't an off-the-shelf product. Need more opportunities, says Tanya. Regional veg lists, species and seed knowledge, seed literacy. All right, I'll just leave. Any final comments that people would like to put up? Okay. And Lucy says we need a two-way dialogue because that to develop the best possible outcomes inside of it. So I just want to have a quick discussion about some of the key points, and I'd like to throw to you, Cameron, about the importance of a specification schedule that actually works. I thought it was a really good point that you raised in the group that we were in, saying that quite often a lot of these things from the ultimate end users, they're driven by standards and schedules, and quite often they don't lead to the best outcome. So is that true?
I think there's a number of things that contribute to a poor outcome, but one of those is short lead times, which is what we were focused on in the group discussion. There are other things that contribute to it as well, such as species selection not being right for the site. There's no doubt about that, and the chap from New South Wales Main Roads made mention of that. Yeah, I'd probably just pull it up there, JP. There are a bunch of other things like weather and hostile soils, etc., but I think that answers your question.
Yeah, I thought it was the time has come through again and again, but the other one is that quite often the specs are put out with not necessarily the optimal species.
That's right, and then there's the lack of understanding amongst, and this has also been mentioned, in the supply chain, which is quite convoluted. So you have often on those civil projects, you'll have, in our case, Transport Main Roads, head contractor who then subs the work out to a corporate landscaper who will then work with us. And so there's multiple parties that are part of that discussion.
Thank you.
And these specs can be quite rigid. So every time there's a deviation from the spec, that conversation's got to happen, you know, up and down the supply chain.
Mm. Any other points that people would like to make? Any reflections you'd like to share? All right, James is going to put up a poll, and then I'd like to get your thoughts on these polls. So James, can you put up the poll, please? So the question here is the one that I put up at the start. What information do you need regularly? Please tick your top 3. Half of you voted so far. Got 15 of 16. I'll just give it another 10 or so seconds. All right, I'll end the poll there at 15. So let's have a look at the results. So basically, the 2 highest ones were the policies, targets and demand by market. So, you know, it doesn't matter whether you're in the civil space or the conservation sector, just general information about where that market is going in terms of demand. Then what native seed users actually need. So, but what's come out of the discussion here is, you know, there's a lot in the specifications and process that come behind that. And then about half the people actually also would like to know who's who in the zoo, which is the list of suppliers and users. So, and I think that makes sense when you think about it. And when I was working on the slide decks for this, you know, there is some tension between people because people are competing for the business as such, and it doesn't matter whether you're commercial or not for profit. So people need to where things are going, and then there are specific arrangements. But really what's interesting in the discussion here is that within those specific arrangements, there are improvements that need to happen in that system. The next item that we need to move on to is the other aspect of demand is, while this is the information that people can see value in acquiring, also another part of it is ultimately about how it's acquired. So I'm just going to share my screen again. Oops. Sorry. Just having a slight problem with my computer for a second, so just bear with me. Here we go. So the next discussion, and it'll be for a shorter period of this time, is saying, well, if we start creating these sort of spaces where people can share information, what type of forum should be created to facilitate that exchange of information? So this isn't worrying about your direct individual relationships between people, it's as some sort of collective construct. So is it just a general knowledge sharing information forum, which is a community of practice, or something that's more transactionally focused, which I've called a buyer and seller exchange? Would you prefer this forum to be digital and online or in person? And would you like to see one forum nationally or a series of regional and state territory forums? And would you like to see forums for each individual market? So this is conservation, civil, etc. Or would you like to see a forum for all markets together? And these are really important design inputs. So again, James is going to send us off to our groups, but this time spend about 10 minutes, 15 minutes talking about it. And really try to understand the characteristics of the information sharing platform so that we can get some insights about how we can support the evolution of these forums over time. So Laura will put the question in again, but just think about, community of practice, buyer-seller exchange, digital, online or in person, regional, state and territory or national, individual or all together. James, can you send us back to our breakout groups, please? Again, could you just write down your key reflections around the question? It's a generic question across a whole bunch of different segments. So my observation, a few people were struggling with it a bit. That's to be expected. So it's, but again, could you just write down your key reflections in the chat box, please? Code of practice, says Adele. Face-to-face, Victorian Oz wide, says Tanya. A mixture. Everybody together, says Lucy. The difference between the not-for-profit and commercials is something challenging to navigate, says Tanya. A range of different forum formats, says Martin. Face-to-face statewide, says Kathy Olive. Okay, let's, a demand forum would offer limited value to Aushort. If it was generic, then a national forum might be useful, says Cameron. Okay, we're going to put a poll out on this one. So James, could you put the poll up, please? Okay, so basically we've got all these different types of forums and we just want you to nominate whether you have a preference for a particular type characteristic or whether you want both inside of it. So there's it's a 4-part question just go ahead and fill that out. And welcome back, Lee. We got about 3/4 of the way there.
Yeah, all good, all good. Cheers.
Still waiting on 5 people to put an answer in. We'll just give it another 30 seconds or so. Up to 13. 15. Just give it 10 more seconds. Okay. So community of practice was the highest response, but also people about 40% are interested on both. Digital was strongest after both. State-based seems to be the most common out of it, and then all markets together was the answer that was most there. So difficult question, so thank you for sticking with that one. I want to have a quick plenary discussion for 10 minutes now. And this is an open question. What can the native seed sector do to help create demand? So you all operate in different parts of it, and many of you shared some frustrations around how the way the system's going. But what can you do to help sharpen up and create demand? What should the strategy talk to about actually creating demand as opposed to organising demand?
Just from where I sit in infrastructure world, I think there's a lot to be said for showing and declaring what works well and being clear about what doesn't, but not talking about it just in environmental or ecological terms, but framing it in such a way that talks about the value of the investment or the value of its performance. So you begin to speak in metrics that other industries can appreciate and understand the value of it then. And that would help focus the demand to the correct parts, rather than just making an assumption that, all seeds grow the same way, or, that I can get any seed from the same place. Because until that education catches up with it, but it is such a specialist kind of field. It's a subset of a couple of bigger industries, that I think the core knowledge, certainly the expert knowledge, is always going to be held within that sector only. It's going to be difficult to popularize. So expecting the broader industry to make the moves to understand demand, I don't think will ever happen. Yeah, you're going to have to work the other way and speak other people's languages.
And what other value are people looking for, Lee?
They want to know that what they're investing in or what they're buying is fit for purpose, will perform as expected, or as, either a botanical book or the expert tells them it will, but it will work in the way that they need to use it. Not everyone can plough the seed in properly. Not everyone can take the time to propagate it and place it in their location. And certainly in my world, we use those large scale broadcast methods, and sometimes, well, rarely and sometimes never will we actually go back and check on whether it grew. But there's so many external variables to seeding operations on projects that you can never really get on top of all the quality issues for every component of it. And the way that it's often written in specs is to blame the supplier or blame the collector for poor seed, or the designer for a poor design. And sometimes there's nothing wrong with that. It's just how it was used. But it's very difficult to, because it's a field where there's even disagreement in the experts, which I guess is true in horticulture and revegetation. And there's so many different types of spaces and areas around the country, or even in the state, and it's all changing. All this landscape design and vegetation work, some of it's just forecasting, and then it does what it does because of whatever event happens next. So asking people to have confidence in processes for a situation that may never occur, it can be difficult to get that trust. And so it's not unexpected that people just want to go for the cheapest thing all the time, or they don't appreciate it. But
Yeah,
yeah, to use it like any other natural resource, it should be valued for what it's intended to be used for. But there needs to be much more direction about the value of each of those pieces of the natural resource and when is the best time and place and location to use certain species. And maybe the industry should be protecting certain species for certain types of use rather than just making it broadly available all the time, unless it's at an absolute premium. But even then, it could still be wasted.
Thank you. What do others think? What can we do to create demand and strengthen it and sharpen it?
The demand's there. There's just not enough seed to meet the
Yeah,
demand.
that's right.
So from your perspective, it's your supply constraint.
Correct.
100%.
And we,
I think based on the strategy document that was published by the project, I think there's a whole bunch of activity going on out there, particularly in the industrial markets that Greening Australia or the project's not aware of. And the demand is massive.
and I think you're right. That's what we've identified in the limited amount of engagement we've had with this, the industrial market, as you call it, is that there is a lot of activity in there.
Yeah.
And its dynamics and its opportunities are different to the conservation sector.
Correct.
And then you add to then potentially an offsetting market that could grow quite significantly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that will exacerbate the supply side constraint.
It already is.
Yeah.
And then and all the associated issues that have been brought up. Lee was just talking about compromises on quality, and the other issues that have already been spoken about in previous forums, like training, accreditation, the quality of collection, traceability. It's putting pressure on all those things, and to Lee's point, that's what delivers poor outcomes. And I'm sure that's common in the conservation sector as well as the industrial markets.
Yeah, I'm sure there wouldn't be so much demand from some of the sectors that currently use the seed if we actually use the seed in the right way, because so much of it's wasted and there's so many repeat applications without changing the design or the spec.
Yeah, that's probably right, Lee. But also, if people had trust and in the supply chain,
yes,
and people got a good outcome from the investment, I'm sure that would give them the confidence to keep investing, and so therefore the demand would actually pick up.
Yeah. So certainly having an awareness of what seeds available in different banks can influence some of the designer choices or the way that we might use seed. I posited once to the guy that wrote the Evergreen Connect database for nursery industry, which tells you how many plants are in different nurseries all around things. So you can see its value, and then you can compare the prices.
Yeah.
But that lets you understand the value of it. If there was an equivalent database for seed banks, and so you can really appreciate, no, this resource is at scarcity or it's in surplus or whatever, that can influence the demand for products. But it's also possible to add appropriate commentary or guidance about the usage of that particular resource then as well. But those sorts of broader supply availability issues do actually influence the projects, because no one wants to do the wrong thing really, but through sheer ignorance they often end up doing, or we just continue with business as usual because there's no guidance on reason for change without that awareness.
Do you think it's feasible to get up a database of what's in seed banks?
Well, it's a valuation exercise, isn't it? Someone like Cameron would be better equipped to answer, what markets or what locations are being sold, or where the seed is being consumed through what kind of paths. And there might be sort of like an industry database which could be managed by some sort of other body, and maybe it's only kept up to date every so often rather than monthly, which is the way the nursery one's done, as I understand it. But I mean,
you're not going to get an accurate reflection of how much eucalyptus creeper is in the system today, because Rowena's not going to tell you, I'm not going to tell you, because that's commercial in confidence. But
sure.
Where you might get that type of information is a transparent online marketplace, which will, and you'll see the price signal, and that will tell you how much product's in the system.
That too. Yeah, absolutely. But otherwise, I think the kind of usage that's been done by the really large consumers without an understanding of what the availability is and where it's actually come from, that's not going to change the current demand, and they they don't necessarily appreciate the external influences and factors that might limit or increase demand, weather events or whatever it is. But if there was something that signaled what's available and attached a value to it, that could certainly help moderate demand.
I think that there is an opportunity to create that transparent online marketplace that Cameron talked about, but I also think the question is who sets it up, and also that it just needs a couple of key players to come and start using it, and then it can evolve over time. You're not going to get everybody into a platform like that. The thing that will make it hard to get it up, but it does make it insurmountable, is essentially the range of species that are sold.
Yeah.
It's not, it's not like going to the Chicago Board of Trade for pork belly futures. There are so many characteristics around it. There's lots of different species. And then, of course, there are, once you add in provenancy and all those sorts of things, it really just breaks up into lots of different segments. But it's really about finding a way through to that online marketplace, because then you can have a series of puts and calls. And then it'll really help the market form and clear and take some of the wastage and frustration out of it. But it's a challenging one. I think the strategy is going to talk about a process to get one of those up and running. But the other thing is that it needs to be driven by the market rather than by regulation. Right. So, you see this with all industries as they evolve. This is one of the hardest things to get up and running. But once it gets up and running, you can start to grow. And then over time, you end up with some of it, like I work a lot in agricultural industries. You see amazing transaction databases occurring out there. But we've got to learn to walk stand up before we learn to run. So we shouldn't over-design it up front, because it just won't fly otherwise. Any other thoughts around this before we go into quality? My biggest reflection is that, listening to the discussion around this, is that there are quite distinctly different markets that have different characteristics inside of it, and the strategy needs to speak to both of them, and not just have a total commercial or conservation focus. Restoration versus conservation focus inside of it. Both are equally important, but I like the comment that Lee made, which is describe it in the way that the ultimate end user values it, rather than just focusing on one particular feature, which is often the environmental outcomes for this, because there are many other values and benefits that it provides. So you need to promote those as well. I'll go back to sharing my screen. So I've been through that, done the poll quality. So look, I think all of you have been in the workshops beforehand. Quality is really about, it's got a series of drivers and barriers. It's about what we just talked about, viable seed, the right source. There are barriers around cost, which standard, and of course if any quality standard isn't used, it's not relevant. What What we've heard in the workshop so far is that there is widespread support for a national code of practice, so a standard as such. This second question is really specific around today, is do you support a code of practice forming the basis for the labelling of quality of native seeds supplied to users? And then there's questions around whether it should be voluntary or do you think it should create more, do you think it will create more red tape? So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen here. And say in terms of demand, without worrying terribly, do you think we should introduce a form of labelling around that? That can be flexible, so it has a minimum standard and it works up through some sort of tiered hierarchy to extreme specification. But would labelling help firm up demand in the market and help provide confidence? People express their frustrations about the cost of some of the testing certification costs, but that's only one aspect of a label. It can also be about introducing provenance, source, who provided it, a whole range of different information as well. Do you think labelling will help strengthen demand?
A little while ago, we were trying to develop an in-house specification for the collection and use of seed, and we gave up on it because of just the way that our commercial branch wanted to put the quality enforcement on it. But one of the things that we tried looking at was a broad classification system, which being in transport at the time, we just likened to kind of like a traffic light system, which just a really broad classification of the origin of the seed without specifically worrying about provenance. And the idea was that we could then sort those classifications into price bands. So the first and the premium one would be bespoke collections, targeted provenance, that sort of thing with specific goals and usage in mind. And whether or not that sort of stuff comes out of conditions of approval for the project as part of the EIS or community desire, for local genetics or whatever it is. The second tier of seed grouping would be native seed from, a much broader area where it might be an aggregated provenance, but broadly matching the ecoregion. So you may not know specifically where it came from, or it might be blended up with the same species from elsewhere, but it's still acceptable for use for what you're going to use it for. And then there's seed from anywhere else, which could be overseas or unknown provenance, that sort of stuff. And that would have the lowest value, but it would also be used in the lowest risk locations. So in transport corridors, for instance, it would be along roadsides or rail embankments, which are subject to repeat slashing or herbicide or other levels of impact and disturbance, where you're not trying to restore, conserve or rehabilitate much, you're just trying to get surface cover. And so those broad areas were a way that we were trying to see, is there a way that we can refine this kind of resource into price bands? And obviously, different types of species do then fall into those groups as well, because you can put, cooch or anything else in that lower one. Not that it's a native, but some of those things that, don't actually have a restoration value, they're just a component of the broader landscape. It was a little bit controversial because it's a funny way of dividing up that kind of material and then trying to figure out, well, what happens at the margins of these kinds of seed uses, or how do you add one type of seed to another type of seed then? But that was an idea that we were exploring with, to try and do a broader classification in the first instance.
What do other people think?
The other part of that was that we were going to, we really wanted to get either from the landscape designer side or the ecologist side appointed to the project a specific qualification in seed verification of some sort. We didn't quite know what to call it. And so that would be not only the identification of seed, but understanding the various testing and preparation procedures appropriate for use. So we, in our projects, we often have a position called the surveillance officer, who does all those things like checks the batches and receipts, does what it says on the docket match what was actually delivered by weight and by material and all that sort of stuff. And we wanted to get that kind of position for whoever checks the seed. So in the same way that the Australian Standard 2303 allows someone to go and check tree stock in the nursery, we wanted the project ecologist or the landscape architect or whoever it is who's got the appropriate qualification to be able to check a batch quality of the seed, either at the supplier or something that's delivered ahead of time, to then make sure that whatever's subsequently delivered to the project matches what was there. And that was a distinct value-adding exercise. And the comment we had back from contracts was saying, well, what training would need to be attached to that? And we said, well, FloraBank at the time or whatever other training is offered, we don't specifically know. And then we went down this rabbit hole of, well, what's the national accreditation version of that? What's the recognized certification of that? And that's where we stopped at that point in the specification as well, because we didn't know what the appropriate qualification would be or how to frame it. But that's something that we've been really keen to try and get into our projects for a long period of time.
So you're still keen on it, you just got stuck.
Oh, definitely. And certainly for the scale of work that we're doing and the cost and the risk attached to doing rework, especially, just where we need to do stuff. Because most of our seeding operations, our seed use is on high risk locations, batters where we're trying to reinstate landslips, broader revegetation. It's not sort of flat areas where we're trying to grow stuff. We're using it for stabilization reasons as much as anything else. So having the right qualifications and getting the right result and preventing erosion and slip and all sorts of things is an important activity for us, especially after the transport corridors are operational and you can't by law get people back in to do this work. So we see that as a valuable paid position for industry, and whether or not it's attached at the project level or it's part of a service that the supplier offers, but you have to pay for it at the time of seed acquisition. There's any number of ways that it can be done, but we think that's an important quality control step to make sure that what we are buying by demand matches the needs that we are going to use it for.
Thank you. Martin, you've been silent today. Would you like to make a comment?
Yeah, I've been sitting back a bit, but look, I think we definitely we need a standard of seed. There's lots of mechanisms. I think the starting point is this: if you've got a code of practice, underpinning that code of practice, you need some sort of specification system. And I think that can start at a lower level, as you say, and increase over time as demands and more specific needs need to be met. I'm really keen on the idea of having seed collection zones. They have a de facto sort of provenance notion about them within regions, and having a national coding system for seed so that the actual number gives you a whole lot of information. You're starting with, N for New South Wales, and then, MY would give you the Murray catchment, and then, East, West, Central, and then a numbering system, and then year of collection. So the actual computer coding number, it's designated at a regional level, and then individual collectors can be designated numbers, collection numbers, attached to those prefixes in any collection year. And then just by numbering, it gives you the capability of sorting. Okay, well, you immediately know that seed batch has come from this area in this zone and in that particular year. So automatically a numbering system. And then the database that's connected to that number can supply all the information: who collected it, was the batch checked? Has it been through a license system? Has it been accredited? Then, you know, if required, germination and other information can be attached. And ultimately that system can then be live and traceable through time. I know in the Murray that we have the sort of the basis of that system and that database, and we can go back 30 years and identify what seed has gone where. But I think until you've got that identification system in place, it is all really ad hoc and just impossible to drill down further.
So Martin makes some good points about saying that the other thing is some consistency in the way some of this is structured across various parts of the sector, so we don't end up with duplicative systems that don't talk to each other.
And that's really important if you're going to have feed into regional projects and ultimately state projects. And also becomes essential if the notion of seed transfer zones and climate change comes into play. It moves from being an ad hoc sort of process of going out and trying to find seed to actually have transfer zones. You know, the anticipated this zone is going to be the zone for this range of species for this zone, which is south and east of that zone. So it automatically allows that level of thinking and planning that's automatically in place. And I think there's a whole range of things, as Lee said, that then within that you can have that. I like it. Always like the idea of a traffic light system. That it's a simple way of just colour coding. These are the highest quality batches attached to these numbers, and that can be again tick boxed at a regional coordination level. You know that it's met this, and this. That's your highest standard, and then you've got other seed which can be used for a whole range of other, whether it's just biomass or grazing or whatever it is that use is going to be.
Thank you, Martin. So we're getting to the last 15 minutes. Just as a quick check, I think I'm right in saying this, but has everybody been to a workshop already? If you haven't, can you put up your, just use the reaction and put up a thumbs up. Yeah, so everybody's been to one, so so we don't have to do some. James has got a new communications question, so we are going to do that one, but I won't do the poll on the challenge or anything like that, because I'd hate to see you change your mind. I think the challenge has been reasonably well accepted, so we're not going to poll on that. But we do need to spend some time on comms. Because we're just talking about in relation to demand, and we're going to run the Code of Practice server poll again now, so we can just capture it and just contextualise it in relation to this. So particularly, I think it's the second or third question about the use of labelling. So James is just going to put the poll up now. They got 8 out of 12. Ten out of 12. We'll give it 10 more seconds. All right, let's call it quits there. So I'll just share the results with everybody. So Code of Practice 100%, Alternative to licensing and regulation, no is the highest response here. Voluntary at 50%. And do you think it would create more red tape? Equally split there. And should we introduce be part of some form of labelling? Very high response there at 90%. Okay, so while we just, before we get into the close of the workshop today and talk about what happens next, I'm going to pass over to James. He's quickly going to take us through some around communication. So James, over to you.
Thanks, JP. Yep. So as JP said, it's largely repeat guests to this session, so I won't jump into the full comms presentation because those insights have already been captured. I'll launch the poll, which you will have all seen, but we've just added one new question, the very last question, which you'll see on your screen now. So there's been a lot of interest in receiving newsletters, emails, the virtual form of comms around Project Phoenix. So we've just added in a new question to get some visibility on what the awareness is like for the current Project Phoenix online network. This currently already does exist, but we just like to get an idea of how many people are subscribed to it / even aware of it. So if you have heard of it before, feel free to let us know. If not, it is there, but just click no in the box so we can get an idea of if the Project Phoenix online network actually does need to be pushed a bit harder.
Is it a feature of this poll that you can only select one option in some of them rather than multiple options?
Yes, that's right. So
Right.
some are single answer, some are multiple. Okay, so that's quite interesting. So it's looking like, just looking at the real-time polling results, it's looking like there is kind of an awareness deficit around the Project Phoenix network. Currently have 9 and 12 votes. Great. 11 of 12. So JP, we might just give it another 30 seconds or so, but feel free to commence the wrap up.
Great, thanks a lot, James. So look, I found the response there around the deficit around the Project Phoenix one is probably a good way to open up the closing of the discussion here, because what we have is we have essentially a really important sector, and one that has plenty of opportunity and potential, that really has some quite different drivers, partly because everything's focused on slightly different bits. I suppose the technical term I'd use is that seed is an input into something we're trying to achieve rather than the outcome in itself, even though there are a lot of livelihoods and that are reliant upon it. So the other thing that's quite clear in the discussion today is the conservation sector is different to how it was 10 years ago when there was more money in it. But the commercial sector is going gangbusters. I mean, this infrastructure related sector is going gangbusters at the moment, and it's huge. And that's fairly consistent with what we're hearing. And then we have these emergent areas where people are interested in, like the novel products, and which are very micro at the moment, but have potential to growth. And then you just have offsetting, which is big in some states in Australia, particularly at the moment, and around biodiversity. But then you add carbon offsetting to it, and there's a reasonable expectation that will firm up over the next 10 years. Then all of a sudden you see the demand for native seed will increase markedly. But a lot of these industries, particularly in the non-conservation sector, are not doing it as the environment as the ultimate outcome. There are other outcomes associated with it. So Lee spoke very clearly around the need for that. But the other thing that needs to happen is there needs to be more information sharing, not only around the knowledge and the training, which I think there's already a lot of it's there, and that code of practice can pull that together. But there needs to be ongoing promotion about why it's important, but also how to make it work has come out of it. And, you know, people have referred to that in previous workshops as consumer education, because without promotion and also without sharing information and bringing it together, it will remain in its parts and it won't essentially get to its potential as it quickly can. But to do that, we have to create events where people find value out of it. Now, I'm just going to share a slide that Laura's quickly knocked up to say, here are the key takeaways from the discussions that she's pulled out. So basically, the first point is that, you know, people see value in buyer-seller dialogue and a community of practice. An online marketplace would be nice to see it emerge, but there also needs to be in-person events. They're about showing demand, provenance, quantity, species list and expertise. There needs to be a resource that's filterable and accessible. And there is a willingness to share for information to grow the sector, although it seems to be more prevalent in the conservation part of it. But when we talk about it, we should talk about it all, because even those who operate in the conservation sector trade outside of it and vice versa. We need others to value and want to use seed and educate buyers, support users to correctly use seed. There's a role for a broker, which is called a third-party go-between. But I also says to me that it's also really talking a lot to the end user, which is the people, you know, the Woodsides and more of the actual transport, you know, for New South Wales, for example. Certainly in the commercial sector, the demand exists and they are supply constrained and seed is wasted. And actually, it's not just in the commercial sector, it's all parts of the sector that we are facing supply constraints, and that we need a code of practice. There needs to be uniformity around it, and it has to be able to be broken down into various parts of the industry. So I think that's the final bit I've got to say there around that, some of the key points that we discussed. We've got 5 minutes left. Based upon my quick summary there, do people have any reflections they'd like to share?
Just really quickly, I've posited to some of my colleagues in the industry, it's along the same idea that the nursery industry has the pot levy, for instance. And I've always wondered why the big bulk consumers, people like transport or mines, you know, after a certain volume amount of seed ordering, why don't we just pay a $20,000 levy toward an education campaign or a seed management campaign to the Australian Seed Society or whoever? I mean, that sort of money for the scale of our work is, I hate to say it, but it's a blip. That's barely coffee money for some projects. But if we can afford to do it, because we are such big consumers of it and we are so wasteful with it, it's a form of making a contribution towards both improvement and as well as a kind of a penalty. And we do a very specific class of work. So if by volume, this tariff or levy amount would be triggered, that shouldn't penalise entities who are doing conservation work who are still using the same size, because they're doing their work for a very different kind of reason with very different species mixes. But you know, in the same idea that there's a large churn of materials, there's a large churn of project managers and our things. It's generally accepted that when we're doing landscape work with planting, that the cost of plants and the pot levy is just part of the budget. So with the amount of seed that we use and the way that we use and the timing, that should just be part of the project cost. But you know, when we do projects, a small project for us is $100 million. So, I mean, imagine what you could afford out of just a small percentage out of that. I think it would be a great news story for a lot of state government departments who do the work at our scale to be able to make this contribution, knowing it's going toward a global improvement anyway. And it's certainly mutually beneficial to us as well.
I must say, Lee, that when we've talked to some of the big users like yourself and some of the private companies, like some of the mining companies, there is support for that idea. And then the other thing, as I'd say about introducing an industry levy, there's actually a process around that. For my sins, I'm actually known more. I know all 263 that are currently involved in primary industries around this. But to get a levy up, you have to turn up to government as an industry and say you want it. And so I think the goal of getting a levy up is something that's worth thinking about. But also that will take a considerable period of time. You know,
Yeah.
so it's, governments tend not to like imposing levies on industries unless they agree that they think it's a good idea.
Well, as part of the framing of it, so we're talking about the valuation of the seed industry and the seed as a resource. So rather than as a tariff on the industry, it's a promotional value for the cost of buying and securing the seed. Instead, I think that would be a better way to frame it, and that would then really focus use of, you know, why are we buying this much stuff and how are we going to use it. So it might actually have a you know, a moderating effect and try and actively be less wasteful with it in my world anyway.
Great. And I think this issue of waste, which has come out strongly today, is a really important one. So any other final reflections that people would like to share?
I've got more of a question of Lee. How, I think the idea is really good. It's just how you would direct, you know, again, it's this notion of where the money goes and then how it's used. Because again, there isn't a structure yet that represents the entire industry, and there isn't a process for redistribution. Or is it about promoting the importance of seed and promoting the standards and all those sorts of things? Is that?
Yes. Yeah. The short answer is yes to the latter. But it's as soon as something like a code of practice or a national peak guidance document is available, but preferably an Australian standard, that gives it a, you know, an imperator behind it and a level of seriousness that it, you know, the issues attached to it need to be valued and they need to be paid attention to, and there's some sort of compliance and policing that goes with it, because that's where you then get the uptake in quality.
The floor bank guidelines will be out really soon, and that'll be, you know, the updated version of the Australian kind of guidance that had huge industry consultation. So hopefully that will be able to better inform seed purchases as well. But if you've got a list of things that you need, can you just email me? I mean, like, there's a lot of people that can help in the industry, and a lot of people are really dedicated to making a change. And, you know, Martin and I provide training for people. And if we know where the training needs are, we can develop training to do it. And it's not just us, there's a whole bunch of people. You know, there's people who know how to do seed testing of native seeds that are looking for work. So, you know, better match, you know, what's needed with what's available.
It's something that, you know, exists in a lot of the other landscape sector as well. The difference is between the status of a guideline versus something that's a condition or an absolute requirement. So you can have as much best practice or best direction and education stuff as you want, but if there's not a specific requirement to use it, then, you know, even the big contractors won't use it.
That's the difference with the mining sector, is they've got completion criteria. So without completion criteria, a lot of them wouldn't be doing best practice, and then some of them are going beyond best practice. So, you know, maybe developing completion criteria for your industry might work as well as it has done in certain parts of the mining sector. And that's really driven, you know, improvement in practices, because they are, you know, ranked according, you know, the job's not done until it's done right.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, another way to enforce that for us would just be to make sure it comes through planning and it's a condition of the project. Has the seed been verified and audited? Have you complied to whatever practice document? And so if that's suddenly a condition that comes from planning and the project can't be completed without that condition being satisfied, we'll have to comply with it, and whatever it costs, it costs. Yeah.
I think the specification, is an essential component at the next tier of the code of practice. The code of practice is the lowest level, and then specifications go up and up, and there's almost no limit to
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll talk
All
to
right.
planning about that because we managed, so the translocation guidelines is already in the planning documents. Like if you want to do a translocation of the threatened species, it just says refer to and follow the translocation guidelines. So there's no reason we can't do that. Like if that's what's needed, then yeah, let us know. We try and figure it out.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to draw the meeting to a close. So thank you very much. The process from here. So basically, we now go into state and territory workshops. We're going to go through each of them. There'll be a series of national workshops. The people wanted a bit more time to join in, so a number of workshops have been carried over to the middle of May. I think about the 10th to the 13th, we're holding a range so that everybody can have their say. Those in that last one will be more consolidating. After that, we're going to go away and write out a draft strategy, work it through with Project Phoenix, and then convene probably a national summit. We're still designing that to come to put it on exhibition and to get people to engage around that. So James has got the information now, and you'll be informed about where the process goes from here. So finally, I just wanted to say thank you very much for your contribution today. There were broad questions, they were hard questions to get into, and I thought everybody worked very well on it. So thank you, have a good afternoon. And for those who continue on with the state workshops, I look forward to seeing you then. So thank you, everybody.